Welcome to the MEND, a podcast for survivors and victims of crime, sponsored by the Center for Crime Victim Services here in Vermont. I am Anna Nasset, and I am your host for this bi-monthly podcast and show. Today on the show, we have part two with Kesha Ram back here to talk about systematic oppression, white privilege, and racism in our state and country. Thank you so much for joining me again for part two.
Thanks for having me back, Anna.
Because one just wasn't enough.
It is a big topic, big set of
It's a
topics.
big topic. So where we left off, we were talking about anger that people of color feel for continuously having to be asked questions, be the spokesperson for everything, and so we're talking about that, and we started to get a little bit into policing. And so
Mhm.
I'd like to start this episode off by segueing into law enforcement, the abuse of power and mistrust that we see and need to reform a system that was set up for cops to protect me. I mean, quite frankly, I love all the cops I've worked with over the years because we have a system that was set up to protect me. And something like for me that's really important is that we address how it was not set up for everyone.
Mhm.
And can you share with us how you see historically and now what we have going on in policing and what we need to be working forward to in regards to police reform, defunding, restructuring, all everything?
Absolutely. Yeah. So one thing that I always appreciated about Police Chief Mike Sherling, who's now the head of public safety in the state, but when he was Burlington's police chief, he would start almost every meeting that I was present for, and especially ones about addressing bias in policing, by saying, I want to acknowledge that the history of law enforcement agencies in this country is one of protecting white wealth, white bodies, and really systematically oppressing people of color, anyone who would rise up against their employer, anybody who would rise up and try to change their community in a way that benefited people of color or got them the resources that they need. And then you had a lot of folks who went back and forth from Ku Klux Klan, at night, to policing during the day, had no repercussions for the terror that they were raining down on Black communities and communities of color. And some of the only times in history that our military has been used against Americans on our soil, were times like the rising up of miners who were both Black and white in Kentucky and West Virginia, who were together demanding better working conditions, and that was incredibly frightening for the status quo and for those in power to have poor white folks and poor Black folks know that their struggle was the same. So we see actually a really intentional history of dismantling that wealth, or of creating tension between poor white folks and poor Black folks in order to maintain the status quo that we have. Police have been really complicit in that. And in fact, the FBI and others have been investigating the resurgence of white nationalism present in our police departments. That's not to say that I think there are some real reasons that police need our special attention and support, just like any job where you're being fatigued by how much trauma you're experiencing, fatigued by the sort of combat mentality that you have, that we talk about combat fatigue for folks in the military. We talk about trauma fatigue for people in social work, et cetera. But when you really sort of combine those two in policing, where you feel like there's violence coming your way and you're seeing friends of yours, from high school or the community die of an opioid overdose or experience domestic violence, you start to become hardened. And
Mm-hmm.
so there's this whole continuum of people who I think are really shouldn't be police officers, who might have reasons that they want that power and control, to folks who, start out really wanting to do the right thing as police officers and become traumatized by their experience. And all of this to me leads to, reimagining what public safety looks like in the 21st century, and reimagining how we spend our resources. Frankly, having traveled to other countries where police just are not used the same way, don't have the same history, things look really different, right? All of us from all of our movements have been talking about the opioid crisis, for example. And our solution in the US is to crack down on a particularly Black and brown people who we identify as drug dealers. The war on drugs was largely something that led to, millions of Black men going to jail, to the point that, you know, they have rates of incarceration that are far above any developed country and most underdeveloped countries. So, we have a policing system looks really different and doesn't really take care of our public health issues. If you look at a place like Portugal, when they look at drug enforcement, 90% of that money goes to social workers and medical care and social services that treat that person. And about 10% goes to, reducing the supply. But you can't really focus on, just attacking people on the supply side. It just makes it more expensive, right? So when we look at, about 5% of what policing involves is investigating very serious violent crimes like rape and murder. And a vast majority of what they're doing now, kind of makes money for their law enforcement agency and gets them easy wins, which is drug enforcement. And, just locking people up, just interrupting the supply chain for a moment actually makes those products more valuable and doesn't make us any safer. And so, we've had this very long experiment in policing that has not made us safer in many ways. And yet, at the same time, we've had really, we've attacked, what urban plights with a lot of different prongs. And, creating a community garden and better, safer housing for people is probably just as effective at reducing crime, in inner city neighborhoods as is having more police on patrol. But, the way that we've put a lot of police officers in schools, the way that arrest might happen for kids in elementary school, particularly Black kids and kids with disabilities, it's something that we have to really question. Are we any safer or better off now? And I'm glad to see a majority of Americans starting to question that in this moment.
Awesome. Thank you. That's a good stump speech right there. If you're tuning into this episode for the first time, this is Kesha is running for state senate in Chittenden County, and I know I would really value her leadership in our state on, police reform and so many other issues. And I just think that you've got such a great voice. So thank you. Sticking with the police reform, in our last episode, you mentioned that you were arrested by the police when you were 13 years old.
Yeah.
Would you feel comfortable sharing a little bit more about that story?
I would. And in fact, I had not talked about it publicly very often until we were doing a racial bias in policing bill in the legislature. And a lot of folks, well-meaning, folks in the legislature said, I don't understand why we would collect race information. Don't we want to avoid bringing up race? And it's like, for those of us who've had the experience of feeling like we're being treated differently by law enforcement because of what we look like and the color of our skin, we're really curious what race they think we are, right? And that really related to my early traumatic experience with being arrested and detained. I was 13 years old. I was with two friends of mine, one who is Native American and Black, and one who is Thai and Vietnamese. And we were half a block from my friend's house. We were teenagers, and my friend had, I'm going to make light of this because I wanted it to be a lighthearted night. It started out that way, but she really wanted pimple cream. She got a really big pimple right next to her nose, and we had to go to the grocery store and get her some cream.
It's a teenage emergency.
It was a teenage emergency on a school night.
Yes.
We were over to her house to get to school early. We have to go to the grocery store. There is such thing as a teenage curfew or a young person curfew in LA at 9 p.m. Never heard of it until that night. Never seen it, brought up with any of my white friends who frankly did, some worse things. And yet, that night we trudged out of the house at about 8 o'clock. We went to get her cream, and on our way back with a bag in our hand from the grocery store, we were on a corner where we could see her house, a busy intersection in LA. And two police officers pulled over and simply asked, "Are you Mexican?" And when we kind of muddled through our answers and didn't know what that meant or why they would ask us that, we said no eventually. And, they said, "Are you sure? Are you sure you're not Mexican?" Yeah, we're pretty sure, So they said, "Anyway, do you know what time it is?" And it was like 8:45, and none of us had watches, and it was kind of before the days of smartphones. So You know, I don't remember, we just didn't have the time, but we thought it was like 8:45 p.m. Well, we're taking you to the station, as we're pleading and saying, talk to her mother. We're half a block away. We went to get pimple cream. My goodness. Um, and instead, you know, they drove us about 45 minutes away to their police headquarters, handcuffed us first to a wooden bench in the hallway, where the sergeant came out, and we thought maybe he'll be on our side, you know, where here it is getting to 10 o'clock at night and we did nothing wrong. And instead, you know, he's yelled in our faces while we were handcuffed to a wooden bench. Eventually, as it got later, they handcuffed us to office chairs while they were filling out the paperwork, and took a real good long time filling out the paperwork. And it was a school night. It was getting past midnight. And an officer came over who said in a very friendly way, hey, you know, don't you think it's a little late to have these young women here on a school night? And we thought, wow, like somebody's going to come redeem police officers in our eyes at 13 years old, and make us realize that there's good and bad officers, and that, you know, they just had to know the situation, and that we needed our parents called, and they hadn't called our parents yet, and that person would help us. And the two officers detaining us said, bless you, you know, the two officers detaining us said, no, it's fine. We're getting overtime for this. And that officer who came over and questioned what was going on kind of let out a half-hearted chuckle and walked away. And I just remember feeling like, okay, this whole place is not meant to serve me, not meant to keep me safe, not meant to straighten me out on any path, you know, that you know, helps me feel like a more like a young person who's like sort of needs to be, you know, a lot of people I think would say, oh, well, sometimes you need to be scared by the police to kind of do the right thing. That's not what happens with a lot of brown and black kids. You know, you really get the message that someone else has control over your life, and, you know, can take your freedom away at any moment for really inane reasons. And I just remember that night they waited till about 1 or 2 a.m. and called our parents, who were worried sick about us and had no idea where we were. We said we were going to the store.
And hours later, I can't even, yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, just the fear that you put in the hearts of parents. Most white people, I realize, can't imagine that that's what the police would do to their kids who went to the store half a block away from their house. Would fill them with terror that their kids are less safe and they're somewhere that, you know, is a scarier place for them. So, and I remember, you know, my two friends, their moms came and were very apologetic, and, you know, had like, we taught our kids to stay away from the police and not do anything bad, and we're really sorry. And I'm sitting there thinking, like, this is an outrage. And my father came to get me, and my father, you know, an Indian man who came over to go to college and heard not only go back to Mexico a bunch from, you know, people in the streets of Los Angeles, but was pulled over, you know, very frequently by the Los Angeles Police Department from his college years on to, you know, having us as young kids in the car. You know, are these stolen license plates? Are these stolen tires? Is this a stolen vehicle? So he gave us a really deep mistrust of the police. And I just remember, I thought, I don't know what the difference will be tonight if my white mother comes to pick me up or my brown father. He was the one who came to get me, and just screamed at the police officers. And I felt like slight vindication, but also like he might end up arrested too, and we're both going to spend the night here.
Yeah.
Because that rage exists for so many Black and brown people in the US, that rage, that feeling of like, you know, how dare you call yourselves people who are here to protect and serve? And I guess my big takeaway for, you know, white listeners is that almost every person of color you've ever met has an experience like this with the police if they've grown up in this country. You know, it took me a long time to realize that there were people who thought the police did add value to their lives, that the police, you know, made them feel safer. I just grew up not knowing what that felt like, from my father's experience to my experience. I think I said this on social media, but, you know, after that experience, it was almost 10 years later when I was lost in Washington, D.C., that I saw a police officer and went over to him and asked him for directions, and was shaking and just thought, I was so scared to approach a police officer for anything, let alone I was lost. And, you know, so what some people think of as their arbiter of public safety, other people feel like are the scariest people they can encounter on the streets.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that story. And I think it is a really important story for white listeners to hear. I mean, yeah, I don't have children, but the whole time I'm thinking like I couldn't even imagine if that was my child, like not knowing where they are and fearing the worst and then finding out that they're at a police station being
Mm-hmm.
harassed. It's just, and you're right. Like I think that I recently was driving to Penn State from here in Vermont to Penn State. I was speaking there, and it's an 8-hour drive, right?
Yeah.
So I drove through Vermont, New York, and Pennsylvania. And here in Vermont, like I noticed, like pretty quickly into my drive, like somebody was pulled over, and I looked who was pulled over by the police, and it was a man of color.
Mm-hmm.
And I kept driving along, and that day I probably saw about 8 people pulled over in that 8-hour time period. Every single one of them was a person of color,
Yeah.
every single one.
Yeah.
And I just, could cruise down the road safely.
Right.
And like that was just this moment of like I don't, yeah, I will never fully understand and how you exist in the struggles and the pain.
Yeah. I watched it in my own family. My mother prides herself in never having gotten a ticket. She's this small, kind, white lady. She drove a lot of beat up cars, even as like she was low income for a while as a single mom raising us. And she had some pretty beat up cars, but she could talk her way out of a ticket when they got to the window and saw who she was. And she kind of never understood what happened when I got arrested that night. And I think most people know, if they know me at all, they know that I'm like, I can explain anything, and I use my words to change the path forward and to inspire people. And we had to miss a whole day of school to go to court for that curfew violation. We got to court. I could barely say my name. I didn't get my birthday right. I could barely speak. I was so scared. I was so overcome with emotion. I had no idea what would happen to me for doing what I felt like was not a crime. And I remember the judge sort of asking, like, why were you arrested for this? Like, this seems bizarre, and it was Santa Monica, California. I couldn't answer him. I don't know why I was arrested. I could barely even speak. And, he threw the whole case out, but we had to miss a day of school. We could barely, function. We were so frightened of what was going to happen to us. It cost us probably academically that semester in high school. And I was just filled with so much anger afterwards. I could have become a different person. I could have not seen a way to turn this into something positive in any way, but just think, society's already written me off. They already believe I'm a criminal. So what's the point in doing any good?
Right.
And that really is the school to prison pipeline, is if you're treated like a criminal, in your school, and in your community, you think, yeah, by the time you're 18, why not? They don't believe I'm capable of anything else. And so, that's really, I think, what a choice that I had the privilege to have a family who could say, what did you learn from this? I had teachers who held me through that moment, who helped me write essays about it and try and, complain to the police department, which was futile. I mean, never heard a thing back. But I was still able to say, I can turn this into having a voice in the future and being a voice for others. Whereas a lot of other folks, understandably, might have said, this is over. I owe nothing to society because, they've never given me the support that I need.
Yeah. Well, I'm really glad you chose the path you did. And I know that we are so much better for it. And it's, I mean, with anything, it's like we look back on these really challenging moments, and they are the one that has defined us to do these good in the future. But at the same time, we shouldn't have had to go through that horrible moment.
Exactly. I look forward to a day in this country where, people will say, oh, well, my immigrant family, they were harassed by the police. They went through this trauma. And it's like, wow, I'm glad we can relate on that level, but can we break that cycle? Can we stop making that the American experience to sort of traumatize low income people and people of color and new
Absolutely.
immigrants? Like, how do we not have that be, a big part of what the American experience is?
Yeah, well, and that's kind of leads me into my next thing of like, how do we work to change our system? Like our system isn't just broken, it was built this way. Like its
Exactly.
foundation, its laws are all built on putting Black, Indigenous, and people of color down so that white people can be on top. Like,
Right.
what, how do you envision the future, and what work should we be doing?
Yeah, well, I really want to give credit to people like former Rep Kaya Morris and Tabitha Moore of the NAACP and others. Um, one of their efforts that has, I think, really started to show up and transform our system is the Coalition for Ethnic Studies in Schools, and trying to change whose story is told in our school systems. That work can start to happen at a very young age. With preschool age kids, you can start to teach them about the people who stewarded the land before we were here, the Abenaki people. You can teach them about how to celebrate difference rather than be afraid to talk about it. And I think that's really important work. I mean, I was talking to the third graders that my first grade teacher is now teaching, and she asked, hey, would you talk to my kids? It's such a hard time for them in LA with the riots. And at the same time, she said, some of the kids, their parents haven't told them that there's riots or that there's racial unrest or anything about this. And, if you make these subjects taboo, then first of all, kids, they want to talk about them in unhealthy ways, right? They start to use the N-word or make fun of the situation, or parrot what they hear on TV without really thinking about it. And that can be really harmful to their friends, even if they're people that they care about, people of color. And then people of color really get traumatized in school, and in fact don't feel like the curriculum supports their viewpoint, even though we know that some of these textbooks are really, really one-sided and narrow in their perspective. So
Mhm.
teaching about eugenics, teaching about the history of the Buffalo Soldiers in Vermont, and the history of slavery that even existed here, taking kids to the Rokeby Museum and seeing the last stop on the Underground Railroad. These are all ways I think that we start to change the culture in a bigger sense. And then at the same, I have a 5-point racial justice platform, things that we've been working on for years. And we now have bigger coalitions built around. But certainly, I mean, I remember years ago, I tried to introduce legislation to get independent investigations into use of force cases that resulted in a death with the police. And at the time, the police union was very strong. The police lobby is really strong. And I was shut down pretty soundly. There wasn't a big coalition. There wasn't, the NAACP didn't have the same influence, wasn't as organized then. And I really felt kind of alone, in trying to address criminal justice issues. And in fact, the goalposts keep moving. We know that there's huge disparities in Vermont, but we keep hearing, oh, we need more quantitative data, then we need more qualitative data, then we need a new study, then we need a new commission. We really need change, and we really need law enforcement to understand that if they don't have people's trust, they don't have an effective agency. So I think they're finally starting to see and understand that with some of the statements with action behind them. And then I think there's just a whole, when you look at the pandemic, when you look at a whole host of, housing issues or access issues, then you constantly want to be surprised, but aren't, by patterns that people of color are getting left behind. Information isn't in other languages. Systemically, we continue to leave behind new Americans, people of color, people with disabilities, low income folks. And there's just so much intersectionality there. I can't help but always be asking, who are we missing? Where are we not putting resources where there's real distress? And so, people can visit my website, KESHARAM.com, KeshaRam.com, and see more about our racial justice platform. But, Vermont's exceptionalism, I think, has been the issue for a long time. We're so great and we have so much equity. We have great schools. So we couldn't possibly be having these problems. Well, first, we are having these problems. There are people who are certainly left behind, especially new Americans in our schools. When you look at judicial punishments in schools, it's far and away kids of color and kids with disabilities who are being punished in schools. It translates into our prison pipelines. And even if these were issues we weren't quite having yet, they're coming, unless we as a state, a very small, welcoming state, can wrap our arms around these issues, we're going to have the same problems as Connecticut and Massachusetts and a lot of places, particularly in southern New England, that have diversified more recently and are grappling with, the othering that happens to people in the aftermath of that. We have the opportunity to do better in Vermont, and I hope we will. It also starts with representation, and it is a huge responsibility, and one that I don't relish, to be the only woman of color running for office this year at the state level. So, I'm constantly seeking out other people to share different life experiences and bring those to the table at the local and state level. So if anybody wants to run for office, you can always reach out to me. I would be really happy not to be the only woman of color in the Senate, or in the legislature this year.
Absolutely. And, always know that we're here to support you too. And if there's any way I can, ever lessen the burden for you, please let me know and just support you and cheerlead for you and all of those things, because it's a huge role. And like you said, you don't relish it, um, but you're doing it. And like that's carrying a lot. So I just want to say that I see that and so much respect.
Thank
Um,
we
yes.
have as I sometimes say to folks, particularly women of color, we can't afford not to speak up. There are times when we think, is anybody else going to say anything? Do I have to be the one to say it again? And we do.
Yeah.
The stakes are too high for the young people that are coming after us. We know the same thing is true for young women, period. That if we don't change a little bit more now, then they'll still feel that they're hitting walls and ceilings and being boxed in. And, as a woman of color, we just simply can't afford not to say something and to make things better for the next generation.
Absolutely. I mean, and for me, just as a woman, it's like, I understand, like, it is hard. Like, there are times where I'm like, I do not want to say anything. I want to go watch my TV shows. I don't want to talk about it.
Yeah.
But yeah, if we don't, who else will? And we have to, because we have to speak up so that it's better for the other generations and that they're not afraid to speak up and
Exactly.
raise their voice.
Right.
So, yeah.
And they see that there's different ways to be, not every person of color right now has to be taking to the streets, yelling into a megaphone. They don't not everyone has to be posting on social media to be making a difference. Raising your kids safely is important. Not feeling the need to educate other people is a radical act of self-care right now. So everybody's doing what they can. And I think the more that especially white folks can understand, like, there's no one way to be a person of color, there's no one perspective to have on this, but also not to tokenize and say, well, my black friend said not to post the video and my black friend said this was harmful. Well, make sure you have lots of perspectives. Don't put that onus on one person in your life, and have black friends, have friends of color, have meaningful relationships with people, where you're really curious about their life experience and not sort of looking for ways to challenge their worldview.
Yeah.
Deeply listen right now, I think is my message to folks who are wondering what to do.
Yeah, and that was my next two question was like, what would you say to white people right now? And, for me it is, I just try and deeply listen,
Yeah.
and luckily I have platforms to amplify as well. So it's like, what, just that's what I've chosen to do. But yeah, if there's anything else that you would like to say specifically to white people right now, like
Yeah.
I said, I hate asking that question because it's like it's not your responsibility to tell us what to do,
Right,
but
right.
I really appreciate you engaging in that.
Yeah, and when I right now what I'm doing on a systems change level, I think is related to what everyone can do. Which is really think deeply about what they're willing to give up. What space needs to be created for others, and um, often you're not really ultimately at the end of the day having to give something up. The pie can get bigger, but a lot of people, when they start to engage deeply in work that might involve them learning more, stepping back, letting other people take a leadership role, that's when they start to get a little worried. What does this mean for me? Does this mean I lose some edge and power that I had? So people have to be willing to take risks. um, I think it's also important right now because we're seeing this moment of racial unrest coming on the heels of and the continued experience of a pandemic. People have lost significant income, they've lost resources, they're stretched very thin, they're trying to survive on so many fronts. If you are really seeking, the support of a person of color to make a difference in your workspace, in your board, etc., compensate them. And if they're saying, hey, I want to reach out to other people and get their voice, set some money aside to compensate those folks too. I have a grant right now with some funding from High Meadows Fund and the Vermont Community Foundation and the Vermont Department of Health. I'm very grateful for, to understand, the experience of digitally underserved communities in the pandemic right now, people who might
Yes.
speak a different language, not have great internet access, all of those things. If we reach them on the phone or WhatsApp or whatever it is to talk to them about their experience, we're paying them. We're paying them for their time, because having the time to tell people how you're doing, to try and make the situation a little better next time we're in an emergency or disaster, that's really valuable information, and people deserve to be paid for their expertise right now. So, if you're going to engage in this work, be willing to be incredibly curious, be willing to risk things, and be willing to put some resources behind it to honor that people, have really been set back.
Absolutely. I think those are all great action steps that we can do. And yeah, and I love what you brought up about paying people. It's, I mean, for me, that's been the other thing is donate where you can.
Yeah.
For me, I've chosen to donate to campaigns of women of color because that's important. It's like, how can we support? Yeah, and
Yeah.
it's not about losing anything or missing out on anything. It's like, during this time now, especially where it's like we're not going out to eat.
Right.
So, what, like, taking those resources that maybe you would spend on this other thing and putting it over here.
Mm-hmm. The pie
Yeah.
can always get bigger, but the more
Yes.
we feel like it's scarce, the more we kind of restrain its, how many people can feed and how much we can do. And that scarcity mentality, will keep setting us back, especially in big economic crises where we become more tribal or just think, I need to get back in the front of the line. And unfortunately, a lot of the
Absolutely.
federal resources have done that, made people feel like, I don't care if the information's in another language. I'm going to get mine, before it runs out. And
Yeah,
I hate for us to be in that position right now.
absolutely. To kind of shift as we're starting to wind down a little bit, but like what words or actions do you want to say to people of color, indigenous people, black people right
Mm.
now?
Wow, thank you for that. One of my mantras is a quote. I believe it's Nandini Krishnamurti, but it's no measure of health to adjust to a profoundly sick society. And I often have to remind myself of that when you feel really alone, and like you're going against the grain in a really big way, you know, you're sort of keeping your soul and your spirit intact in a way that will ultimately make you feel better about who you are and how you're making your way through the world. And I've often felt, as one of the only people of color in politics in the state, do I change who I am? Do I not say this? Do I say it this way? Do I? People might tell you, don't play that card, do this, say that. And the more authentic you can stay to yourself, and surround yourself with people who will help you do that, the more you'll feel good, win or lose, in an election or in what you're doing. If you try and fail, but you kept your integrity and you were true to yourself, that's certainly a heck of a lot better than changing who you are and also losing. But even feels better, I think, than changing who you are and getting somewhere, because then you're having to leave a big part of who you are behind, every time you walk into that space or take on that role. And so, I felt that there have been setbacks. I've had to work more slowly through, sort of my approach to things. I have middle schoolers and elementary schoolers who are always asking, are you going to be president? And, what I feel like is it's just really nice to be your authentic self and still be able to lead and engage in policy work and politics. And, more than most places I can think of, Vermont still does let me do that. And it's a really special place to be able to interact in many ways, one-on-one or in small groups with folks, and work meaningfully and authentically to solve problems. So, no matter how many people tell me to go back where I came from, I'm not going anywhere. I love this state, and I love all of the opportunity that it's given me and the ability to continue to be myself and move forward.
And we're so honored that we have your beautiful self here and that you're exactly where you need to be. And I love that sentiment, 'cause it's like, for us white people, we do need to change. For everyone else, like, you're doing awesome. Who you are. I mean, that it really is what it is. And so like it was kind of, as I was listening to you talk, I was like, well, okay, that pretty much sums it up. Like, we need to change, and we need to support all of our people of color and indigenous and Black people in this country and across the world to be the beautiful people they are.
Yeah, there's a lot of great lessons in understanding how Indigenous folks have aligned with, you know, environmental protection and stewarded the land. There's great lessons in how Black folks continue to save our democracy, you know, really to the benefit of a lot of other folks that are not them. And, you know, we have so many people, Black and brown, who continue to love this country, just waiting for this country to love them back. You know,
Yes.
and we'll continue to be here to do that. And, you know, we appreciate that more white folks are starting to see how much we love this country and how hard we're trying to save its soul.
Absolutely. That's very well put. So Keisha, you are running for state senate here in Chittenden County.
Right.
And as we said earlier, if you're elected, you will be the first woman of color to serve here in Vermont,
Yeah.
and the youngest woman to serve, period.
That's right. Yeah. I want to pass that tiara on very soon. So, you know, please, young women, come see me. You know, I think when we talk about representation, just looking at women in office, you know, we could note that less than, you know, about 1.5% of all elected officials in the whole country are women under the age of 35. It's a very, very small percentage of elected officials. And yet, guess who makes it to Congress and likes to make the most laws about women under the age of 35, right? All the other men who started in politics very young. So,
Yes.
you know, you have to get in this pipeline and lead, because otherwise laws will be made on your backs continuously, and that's what we're seeing with changes that are so overdue in Congress and in Washington and in our legislatures, so that, you know, we have people who have intrinsic experiences that they bring to the table, so folks don't get left behind.
Run for office, everyone.
Yes, please, please.
um how, like, do you want to speak any more to your campaign right now, and how, if elected, like how you want to amplify your voice to be change within everything
Yeah.
we've talked about today?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I have this awesome young dynamic team working with me, a lot of college students, high school students clamoring for something to do, and my goal right now is to just to keep them safe and, you know, try not to let them run around the neighborhood doing too much. But I just love having that energy and that capacity. People are so hungry for change and to be a part of something. So I love running. You know, I hope I'm successful this time. But the really nice part is just storytelling and engaging, hearing from other folks what's really on their minds, what is, you know, how they want to see the state move forward. I have the benefit of having spent 8 years in the legislature, kind of becoming someone who can navigate the building pretty nimbly, because it was my entire 20s and you just absorb everything like a sponge. And now being back in my 30s, having had a break, having gone to, you know, get my master's degree and having some new ideas and new ways of looking at things, I think that's a really rare combination. And I just hope people see and appreciate that and know that I'll be working for the whole state as well. You know, many of your folks in your audience are in the Mad River Valley, which I love. I've served on some boards in the Mad River Valley. And I've always just said, you know, if you're going to represent Chittenden County, you kind of have a target on your back, right? Everybody thinks you have all the resources and you have what you need. And so it becomes really incumbent upon you to understand what the rest of the state needs, because you're only going to get what you need in Chittenden County if you can also help the rest of the state and recognize that the success of all of Vermont means the success of Chittenden County as well. And so, you know, having traveled to every corner of the state and all along most of the back roads and, you know, just loving the whole state, you know, I'm ready to be that champion for all of Vermont, because that's the way that any of our counties move forward and any of our institutions is if we all move forward together.
Absolutely. That's wise words for how, you want to serve in the Senate, but also for how we can all be living right now and working
Yes.
towards this
Yes,
together.
exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And it's
Yeah,
still such a hallmark of how we try to live in Vermont. And I don't want us to lose that. So I really
absolutely.
working
Well,
with folks.
Keisha, it's been just an honor having you here again. Is
I
there anything you feel like you'd like to add in before we wind down? I know we've covered a lot.
just, you know, just appreciation for you, Anna. I mean, this is the second time, well, maybe third time if you count both of these segments that I've been on your show. And just the ability to have far-ranging, authentic, complex conversations. It's so important right now. So I want to thank you for having me on. I want to thank the people who are still listening, because these are really heavy topics. And
Yeah.
um, some of us, privilege sometimes means you don't have the ability to sort of turn away from this conversation. And for those who have the privilege to kind of ignore this conversation but stuck with it, thank you. It really does make a difference to stay curious and to understand how other people are walking through the world. So I just have deep appreciation for you and your audience.
Well, thank you so much for honoring me with your voice, your knowledge, your time. Yeah, we've worked really hard on this episode together, and I'm just so grateful that you were able to do so. And I'm, yeah, very honored to know you and to have you on here whenever you want to come on.
Same on my end. And anytime you have other angles that you want to get on this conversation, there are some great leaders in the state doing this work, and I'd be happy to.
Thank you. I will definitely take you up on that. So just thank you everyone for listening today to this two-part episode with Kesha Ram. If you would like to learn more about her, you can go to her website, which is kesharam.com. Do
Heart.
not yeah, do not forget to vote
Yes.
in November. And
And in August. No matter
yes,
who you vote for, you don't even, I'm not on some of your ballots and you don't have to vote for me anyway, but August 11th is the state primary. And for many elections, that will probably decide a lot of what happens in November because, we tend to all pull in one direction as a state from time to time when the situation is dire. And this is one of those years. So the Democratic ballot is going to determine a lot.
yes.
So, either way, whichever ballot you pick up in August, you can pick up whichever one you feel like, but vote in August because, every election is an opportunity to determine who your voice will be.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And yeah, definitely vote for your heart and vote for our country.
Yeah.
Lives depend on it right now. Lives depend on our vote. And yeah, I'm going to be providing a list of the resources that you shared with us today. And as always, to our listeners, if you have any questions about the show, I'd love to hear from you. You can email me, Anna@standupresources.com. I'm your host, Anna Nasset. Thank you so much for being with us today on the MEND. Goodbye.